Fulton Sheen, God and the Intelligence. Chapter 3. The Modern Substitutes for the Intellectual Proof. 1. Religious Experience. This deprecation of proofs in modern thinking, or at any rate the tacit agreement to leave them in the background, opens the way to substitutes for the rational procedure, the most popular of which is religious experience. The validity this approach to God passes almost unquestioned. Its general acceptance has been taken as one of the most striking phenomena in modern thought. To it all schools of philosophy make their appeal, whether they be disillusionists, symbolists, idealists, or progressionists. In fact, this is a scarce one single philosophical system in contemporary thought which has disputed its validity. It is so generally admitted as to be accepted as presupposition. It is a recognized measure of philosophical conclusions and strong enough to stand all pragmatic tests. It is even the basis of the necessity of thought, which posits the idea of God. In fact, the man who demands a reality more solid than religious consciousness knows not what he seeks. Modern religion bases its knowledge of God entirely upon experience. It has encountered God. It does not argue about God, it relates. But while religious experience, as the reliever of the ultimate reality, is the accepted way of attaining to God, the question of the nature of this experience is quite distinct from the fact of its existence. The method is widely used, but there is much indefiniteness about its nature. All admit, however, that it is essentially non-intellectual. Religious experience, properly so called, is a certain experience of God in the heart of man, thanks to which God is attained without a reasoning process and with a certitude stronger than that attaching to scientific truth. Professor James, who has done so much to further this philosophy, has defined religious experience as any moment of life that brings the reality of spiritual things more home to me. In mystical experience, the believer is continuous to his own consciousness, at any rate with a wider self from which saving experiences flow in. Those who have those experiences cannot be moved from them by logic or science or persuasion. Professor Alexander has given religious experience a more determined significance by calling it instinct. When we ask how we come by the cognition of God, he writes, we must answer that, as with love and hate and appetite and aversion, it is because the world itself provokes in us a certain specific response which makes us aware, no matter in how primitive a form of God, this religious appetite or instinct is comparable to our appetite for food and drink, which, though it does not make its object, discovers it. 2. Intuition. Religious experience and intuition have this in common. Both deny the necessity of reasoning in attaining a knowledge of God. They differ, however, in this. Religious experience is in space and time. Intuition is sometimes said to be outside space and time, except time in the sense of durée. The experience seizes facts after they have sprung forth from their source or after their evolution. Intuition seizes them in the very process of their evolution. Religious experience is destined for action. It seeks only a value for the present age or the present cosmic need. Intuition, on the other hand, looks not toward the active but rather to the contemplative. It seeks not the exterior but the interior. Intuition transcends the intellect, which is accused of distorting reality and cutting it up into lifeless fragments. Life appears to intellectual apprehension as an extension, as a succession of states. In intuition, we see the reality as fluid, as unfixed, before it is congealed into concepts, before even it is perceived in space and time. It enables us to apprehend reality at its source, as it flows, before it takes the bend, before it obeys the bias which the intellect imposes. In intuition, the seer and the seen become one in an ineffable experience of unity. Intuitional experience gives the whole of things. The knower plunges into the flux of reality and becomes one with it. It transports us into the very heart of the reality, whether that real be a rose, a duration in time, or God Himself. It is a kind of intellectual sympathy by which one sets oneself in the interior of an object in order to coincide with the very reality of that object, with its uniqueness, with that in it, consequently, which cannot be expressed. If intuition or real knowledge transcends discursive thoughts, it is not alone in doing so. In other systems, imagination enjoys superiority over any of the discursive approaches to God. Imagination comes most nearly to the surface as that phase of my psychical life, imagination, narrowly so called, which persuasive phase though it be, the psychologist contrasts with other phases. In this quarter, we glimpse that physical form of spontaneous generation, that becoming ex nihilo, which is the work of real novelty and figures so largely in my account of creative evolution. Imagination transcends thought in that it makes us aware of the limitations of thought. And how do we define imagination? We fail utterly in attempts as definition. 3. Faith hypothesis. More recent literature on theodicy seems to indicate that growing popularity of faith as an approach to God. Of course, faith must not here be understood in traditional sense as meaning the submission of the intellect and the will to a revealed doctrine on account of the authority of God revealing. For our contemporaries, the foundation of faith is not of the intellectual order. It is an effort of the mind to explain its sentiment and to disengage God from some felt contact. Faith is a sum of possibilities, or a hypothesis to be confirmed, or else the practical acceptance of some hypothesis which appears more apt than other to satisfy our needs, tendencies, and hopes. At its root there lies a distinction between knowing and believing. Hence, although we cannot know God rationally, we can nevertheless believe in Him. One of the recent Gifford lecturers, Sir Henry Jones, has called a faith that inquires a faith that stands the test and inquiring intelligence. We approach the fact of life with a preconception, favorable or unfavorable, of the existence and the nature of God, which is the result not so much of external observation as of reflection upon our own nature and needs. Hence, our religious faith or skepticism has the same ultimate use and character as a scientific hypothesis, and its validity must be tested in the same way, simply because we find certain instincts in which our laws do not apparently seem to be verified. We must not deny their existence. Not proven is not disproven. The religious hypothesis, like all others, is never finally proved. It is always and everywhere in the act of being proved. It is the one thing that is being done through creation. It is the experiment, the grand perhaps of the universe. The universe thus becomes a great spiritual laboratory and experimental test of the grand perhaps. Beliefs are no longer dogmas, but truth which the Church challenges the unbelieving world to put to the test, and to the hardest test it can find even among the worst intricacies of the pathetic tragedies of human life. Religious faith is like the test of an invention, and in no wise likes the arguments for or against a theory. It consists in observing how it works. Our faith beforehand in an uncertified result is the only thing that makes the result come true. Suppose, for some instance, that you are climbing a mountain and have worked yourself into a position from which the only escape is by a terrible leap. Have faith that you can successfully make it, and your feet are nerved to its accomplishment. But mistrust yourself, and think of all the sweet things you have heard the scientists say of maybes, and you will hesitate so long that at last, all unstrung and trembling and lurching yourself, in a moment of despair, you roll into the abyss. In such a case, and it belongs to an enormous class, the part of wisdom, as well as of courage, is to believe what is in the line of your needs, for only by such belief is the need fulfilled. Refuse to believe, and you shall indeed be right, for you shall irretrievably perish. But believe, and again you shall be right, for you shall save yourself. You make one or two of the possible universes true by your trust or mistrust, both universes having been only maybes in this particular before you contribute your act. With reference then to the problem of God, we must bear in mind the fact that God is an hypothesis, characteristic of the religious view of the world, and that, like every other hypothesis, it should help to explain the fact to which it is relevant. At this moment, the notion of God as a hypothesis is no more popular in English philosophy than in the German. After a delay of many years, H. Wenger finally brought out in 1912 his Philosophie des Als Ob, which is the inspiration of much of the more recent German philosophy. The author disclaims any affiliation with pragmatism, an idea whose theoretical truth or incorrectness, and therewith its falsity, is admitted, is not for that reason practically valueless and useless, for such an idea, in spite of its theoretical nullity, may have great practical importance. The work is, if we are to believe the author, a fulfillment of the prophecy of Kant, made in 1797, that in 100 years his philosophy would be appreciated and understood. The basis of the thought is fiction and not hypothesis. The two are not the same. Hypothesis looks to reality and from reality receives its verification. Fiction, on the contrary, proceeds as if the thing existed. Fiction is merely an auxiliary construction, a circuitous approach, a scaffolding afterwards to be demolished, while the hypothesis looks forward to being definitely established. The former is artificial, the latter is natural. The fiction seeks to invent, and the hypothesis to discover. Thus we have some idea of the main substitutes for the intelligence. In our next chapter, we shall attempt a more detailed analysis. Chapter 4. The characteristics of the modern non-intellectual approach to God. The explicit nature of these substitutes, particularly of religious experience, which is the most common, becomes clearer when contrasted with the intellectual proofs. Reactions are always more intelligible when compared with that form which they have reacted. A threefold aspect of the reaction may be noted in the matter under consideration. 1. The intellectual approach began with the world, not the world of the internal experience, but the external world of movement. Contingency, varied perfections, efficient casualty, and finality. Its point of departure was extramental. The source of its proofs was in the open air. In reacting against this so-called indirect method, the modern approach placed itself not in the external world, but in self, the world of internal experience. It goes to God, not through the world, but through the ego. 2. The intellectual approach was through the reasoning process built on the world of reality. Between the apprehension of the external world and of God, there intervened necessarily a logical process. The bridge between the two was built by the reasoning mind. God was not given in the world. He had to be sought by means of the world. The reaction against intellectualism naturally insisted on a non-logical process. A God that we had to argue for was not worth having, James contended. Instead of being mediately known, God is said to be immediately known. Instead of being known by reason, he is known by intuition or by the heart, as the great organ of the immediacy and spontaneity. 3. The third difference consists in the values attributed to the receptive approaches. For the intellectualist, the value of the knowledge obtained by reasoning is determined independently of self. As it began independently of self in proving the existence of God by taking its point of departure in the world, so would it let its conclusions be determined independently of self. The modern approach, on the contrary, takes its point of departure in the self, concludes in function of that self rather than in function of the object. The knowledge of God is thus symbolic and intrinsic rather than real and intrinsic. 1. Self is the starting point of the approach to God. Erdmann is the authority for the statement that this very characteristic is one of the predominant traits of modern philosophy. During the last 50 years, men have been learning to find God within rather than without. The God that is found from without is a sterile God, because you have to go to the world which is created to get an inkling of his actual character. God has no meaning to us out of relation to our own lives or to spirits resembling ourselves in their finite grasp and infinite reach. And in the nature of the case, we have positively no grounds for positing his existence outside of that reference. God and self are not two independent facts. To maintain this is to lose our hold upon the experienced fact, that which is the existence of the one in the other and through the other. To put this fact in the first person, it may be said that I experience in myself, in a manner which none other can teach me, the truth of the affirmation that God is. What could be more intimately related to self than imagination, which Mr. Fawcett tells us is the ideal approach for those who have been disheartened by metaphysics of the intellect. If, however, instead of using the imagination to attain contact with the divine reality, we use desire, the self is the same starting point. Desire is essentially personal. Its objects appear before it not because the world has been a provocative cause of them, but because desire is the cause of objects, nature, spirit, and God, appearing before the mind. Mind's knowledge of things must be conceived to proceed from her own nature, it being by her own activity alone that any of these beings are ever appear to her. Dr. Carr has not departed from the method of his contemporaries, even though his manner of expression is different. The God concept, he says, is a result of the mind-body unity, which is enlarged into a conception of universal activity. In the moment of experience, mind and body are not two things but one. It would be impossible even to make the distinction were experience confined to the actual, without outlook on the past and on the future. When we consider universal activity in the same mode in which we conceive our individual activity, then we have the idea of God. It is the intuition of this unity which is the basis of the necessity of the thought which posits the idea of God. From the mere fact that we are conscious of having had personal experience of the divine reality, we know properly that God exists. As H.G. Wells has put it in his own charming style, there is within us an undoubting, immediate sense of God. To seek after God apart from ourselves is as useless, we are told, as for a dog to chase his own tail. The hound of heaven is on his own tail, and the vestige still lures the scent of a foregone conclusion. The kingdom of God is within us, and God himself can be found therein. It would seem, if we would but distill him out. We do not need to prove him. He is not to be found amid the thunder and lightning of Sinai, but is in the very intimacies of our own experience. 2. God is known non-rationally. Not by the use of the affective feeling alone do we begin with the self as a starting point in theodicy. The Cartesian argument from the idea of infinity and the Anselmian ontological argument, as also that of Rosminian school, began also from within. A difference between them is this: their self was the intellectual and not the affective. Modern philosophers, on the contrary, while beginning with self, deny the necessity of reason to prove the existence of God. This would necessarily follow from their avowed anti-intellectualism, did they not further assure us of the uselessness of reasoning. Intellectualism gave God only mediately, that is, through a reasoning process built on the world. Modern systems, on the contrary, give God immediately and concomitantly with the affective state. God is in no case the result of an inference. No longer will philosophy, in these days of labor-saving devices, use the old-fashioned way of mounting to God through reasoning. There is no necessity to go outside us, nor to reason on what is inside us. Why laboriously climb up Jacob's ladder to heaven when we can bring heaven and God down into our very hearts? God is not external to us, but we have a consciousness of him in principle and communicating himself to us. The insistence on the immediacy and directness of which God is attained within the self leads naturally to a diminished interest in the problem of the existence of God. Once it is admitted that God is given immediately, the problem of God's existence ceases to be. Contemporary philosophy has been logical in its deduction from its premises on the point. It has consequently insisted that the important point of theodicy is not the existence but the nature of God. What may, in a sense, be doubted is not God's existence, but God's nature. The reason is obvious. Ultimately, our own credence of the existence of anything must be our consciousness of it. Thus, the religious consciousness is the sufficient evidence of the existence of its object. So far as we mean by God no more than the object of this religious consciousness, the existence of God is not really doubtful at all. In other words, the existence of the object as real is implied in the actual existence of the want, just as in the case of hunger on the lower or animal side of our nature. Hunger as a want obviously could not originate save in a living organism whose very existence depends on its being nourished by food, and therefore presupposes the real existence of the object food. So, in the higher or spiritual side of our being, the actual fact of the need of God, laid deep in the human constitution, implies that God is as both originating and as satisfying it. Men have never believed in God only after they have proved his existence. On the contrary, they were certain they had experienced God before they sought for the rational meaning or the ground of that experience. But what is the exact nature of the substitutes for the old discursive approach to God? It may be an intuition, and this is a direct apprehension of a reality which is non-intellectual, and non-intellectual means that it is neither a perception nor a conception nor an object of reason, all of which are intellectual forms, or it may be described as a sensation, feeling, instinct, emotion, all of the psychological or the biological order, or a synesthetic affection, an excitement of the cheerful expansion, dynamogenic order which, like any tonic, freshens our vital powers. The name of faith state by which Professor Leuba designates it is a good one. Its essentially non-intellectual character may be brought out by comparing it with a bar of iron, without touch or sight, and which, without any representative faculty whatever, might nevertheless be strongly endowed with an inner capacity for magnetic feeling, and through various arousers of its magnetism, by magnets coming and going in its neighborhood, it might be consciously determined to different attitudes and tendencies. Such a bar of iron could never give you an outward description of the agencies that had the power of stirring it so strongly, yet of their presence and of their significance for life it would be intensely aware through every fiber of its being. Just as the iron bar is incapable of any intellectual justification of its polarization, so too are we incapable of demonstrating how God comes into us. The fact is, he is there, and he is there non-intellectually, and is just as real as the thrust of a sword or an embrace. Mr. Fawcett has vaguely but beautifully described this effective approach as a physical form of spontaneous generation. The imagination creates its own life and its own objects, just as desire creates its own objects. It generates them spontaneously within itself and needs no recourse to a principle outside itself. The religious impulse which gives us God, without a syllogism based on block universe, is to be identified with an impulse of life. It is biological and belongs to all the orders. Even the animals have a religious sense. In the psychological order, this religious experience may be defined as a special instance of a perception in a complex. Just as we have an intuitive awareness of our own existence in conscious experience of the existence of physical objects in sense experience, so in religious experience, at its best, the religious object is aware, in an empirical intuition of religious dependence, which proves to be a source of religious deliverance. The conscious person, by the extension or expression of its consciousness, is made continuous with a wider self through which saving experience come. Religious experience means essentially an emotion or a feeling, or better still, a sense of reality, a feeling of objective presence, a perception of what we might call something there, more deep and more general than any of the special and particular senses, by which the current psychology supposes extant realities to be originally revealed. Now it may be asked, is this consciousness, this feeling, this aesthetic affection, a special way of knowing or a special emotion for a particular object? There are some who are inclined to think it distinct from other psychological experiences. Professor Laird asks, indeed, why should we deny that religious experience, and particularly mystical experience, is fundamentally a new way of knowing? Without admitting a special organ for such experiences, it seems that Professor Alexander is of this opinion. However, many other elements, he writes, gather around it and swell the full tide of religious sentiment. Its essential constituent is something with a unique flavor of its own, corresponding to its specific object, and is distinct from other emotions, and its apprehension of its object distinct from the kinds of apprehension. If then there be such a thing as a special emotion for religion, it follows that our knowledge of God, the great universal, is a consciousness of him, which is not of a kind with our knowledge of matters of fact, a consciousness not definable in the ordinary way or sense. This attribution of a special consciousness or special emotion or way of knowing is not general among contemporary philosophers. James does not admit any such special emotion for religion, and for the most part he has been the inspiration of his contemporaries on this very matter. Of greater importance is the particular value of the intellect in the modern philosophy of experience. Admittedly, it does not hold the first place, but does it hold a place at all? The answer is faintly affirmative. While the basis is non-intellectual, its explanation may be and often is intellectual. What metaphysical knowledge or inquiry does is only to bring such immediate knowledge to greater conceptual clearness. What then is the meaning of the proofs for the existence of God? They have, according to our contemporaries, no absolute value. Professor Hornell answers that they are but a making plain what is a sense, is there and possessed by us all the time, but that for all its presence we may fail securely to grasp or clearly discern. Reason with its guiding logic seems a secondary creation, advantaging only finite sentience, miserably supplied with direct or immediate knowledge, who have to infer. The unreasoned and immediate assurance is the deep thing in us. The reasoned argument is but a surface exposition. Instinct leads, intelligence does but follow. Our passions and our mystical intuitions fix our beliefs beforehand. The element of feeling in religion is habitated only by subordinating its intellectual part. Individuality is founded on the feeling and the recesses of feeling. The darker, blinder strata of character are the only places in the world in which we catch real fact in the making. The author of the voluminous space, Time and Deity is in perfect accord with his contemporaries in the view that feeling is and intellect of a secondary importance. Religious feeling itself, he writes, suggests the notion of God, which, when elaborated by reflection, is discovered to be that of the world big with deity. It is the feeling or emotion which images the object, not the idea which induces the emotion. But if God is given by mere feeling, why is it that not every one believes in the existence of God? The answer is interesting. A man may be partially or wholly deity blind, as he is stone deaf. He may lack the emotional suggestibility of deity, hence his unresponsiveness. Both in the chronological and in the logical order reflective development of the religious experience is of secondary and minor importance. There is unanimity on the point. Dogmas are merely the buildings out performed by the intellect into which feeling originally supplied the hint. A recent work on psychology of religion has enumerated in their order the elements producing belief. The first element is the traditional one, effects of training and suggestion in childhood. The second element is of experiences harmonizing with beliefs. A natural factor, the experience of beauty and the harmony of the world. B, a moral factor, an experience of moral conflict. C, an affective factor interior, religious experience. The third and last element is rational, an intellectual justification of beliefs. These psychological interpretations are in perfect accord with the modern contempt for dogmas, which are of course intellectual in nature. They are in no sense the necessary development of religious consciousness, and religion is better without them.